In this video lecture, we will discuss abuse and neglect, as well as the protective services system that works to curb or reduce the amount of abuse and neglect in our communities. Let's start with the case vignette. Alice, who's 75 and a widow, lived in a small apartment with her son Frank, who was 54. Frank had been in and out of drug and alcohol treatment centers for years, but was doing well for the last 6 months since he moved back in with his mother. Alice knew her son had nowhere else to go, so she took him in under 2 conditions. He had to find a job, and he could not drink. Frank found a job, and things seemed to be going well until he stopped coming home right after work. Alice knew he was stopping at the corner bar because she could smell the alcohol on his breath. The 3rd time this happened, Alice confronted her son. Frank immediately became belligerent, verbally abusing her and forcing her to go to her room. The next night, Alice confronted him again, threatening to throw him out if he continued to drink. Frank became enraged and started running towards his mother with his fist raised over his head. Fearing for her life, Alice fled to the safety of her neighbor's house. So is this elder abuse? Or is this just a typical argument, albeit a difficult argument, between a mother and her son? After all, Frank never did touch his mother. The critical issue here is that Frank was threatening his mother, forcing her to leave his presence and causing her to fear for her own safety. This is abuse. And this is a kind of abuse that would certainly be reportable to a protective services agency so that they could intervene. Unfortunately, many family members do not report this kind of abuse, either because they're afraid of retribution by the abuser, or they could be embarrassed that this kind of behavior is going on in the family. Nevertheless, this is clearly reportable abuse. Let's consider another case vignette. Carol, 24 and divorced, lived on the 2nd floor of an apartment with her 2 young children. Living below her on the 1st floor was Beatrice, age 86, a nice old lady who didn't leave her apartment very often because of her arthritic knees and poor eyesight. Carol and her children visited Beatrice frequently and often helped her with laundry in exchange for occasional babysitting. Beatrice loved their company. Every Saturday, Carol offered to do the grocery shopping for Beatrice. Because she could not do it herself, Beatrice was happy to accept Carol's help. Carol thought it was okay to keep $20 of the change each week because she was taking the time and trouble to help Beatrice, although she was never offered any money. Carol thought Beatrice would never realize the money was missing because of her poor eyesight. So is this abuse? This is actually a special kind of abuse called exploitation. Some states refer to it more narrowly as financial exploitation, but regardless, exploitation in all its forms is a type of abuse. Even if Carol hadn't considered that Beatrice would never miss the money because of her poor eyesight, taking such money without permission is clearly exploitation. Let's consider a case vignette at the other end of the age spectrum. You are a teacher in a school. What should you do? Report to the abuse hotline, gather more information, or just ignore it? First, a 7-year-old boy is in your class. Every week you notice bruises on his arms. Some are darker than others and appear newer. He also looks unbathed a lot of the time, and his clothes are worn out. During the winter months, he often wears a short-sleeved shirt and appears to be shivering. On several occasions, he has forgotten his lunch money and has no lunch to eat. You usually arrange for him to get lunch at the cafeteria. So what do you think? Is this abuse? Actually, the 7-year-old boy has all the hallmarks of being neglected. Neglect is considered a type of abuse where the perpetrator is not actively harming the vulnerable person, but is failing to provide for the needs of a dependent and vulnerable person. The bruises on the child's arms may indicate some actual physical abuse, but all the other facts in this scenario also suggest severe neglect, and this should be reported to the Child Abuse Hotline. Here's another scenario. Number 2. A 12-year-old male is one of your students. You know his parents recently got divorced. He tells you that his father's 40-year-old friend fondled his genitals last weekend. Is this abuse? Can you trust what this child says? Realistically, children tend not to lie or exaggerate things like what this child is reporting here. But even if this child was making something up or exaggerating some encounter with the father's friend, as a teacher, you would want to err on the side of caution. You should report this as potential abuse to the Child Abuse Hotline and let the Protective Services investigator make the determination as to what actually happened. Let's first discuss the elder or adult abuse and neglect problem. Each year, there are over 250,000 reports of abuse of adults over the age of 60 to Adult Protective Services, which works out to almost 850 reports for every 100,000 people over the age of 60. And these kinds of reports are increasing in frequency. This could be that the abuse and neglect is more out in the open and or easier to identify, or it could indeed mean that abuse and neglect is actually happening more as the modern family structures change. Nearly 2 million older Americans are believed to experience abuse each year in the United States, according to the U.S. Administration on Aging. It's estimated that there may be at least 5 million elderly victims of financial exploitation each year, and it's estimated that only 1 in 5 cases are actually reported, so the problem might be even bigger than we are even estimating now. Elder abuse, or indeed any abuse of a vulnerable adult, is defined as any knowing, intentional, or negligent act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm or serious risk of harm to a vulnerable adult. Abuse can include a variety of forms, but they can be categorized into 3 general types. First, there is abuse more generally, which could involve physical, emotional, psychological, verbal, and sexual forms. Second, there is neglect, which includes abandonment by a caregiver and self-neglect. Finally, there is exploitation, which typically involves manipulating vulnerable adults to take or steal money from them. In other words, financial exploitation. There are a number of warning signs that a vulnerable adult is being abused or neglected. As a behavioral health professional, you should watch out for these signs. They include that the vulnerable adult actually tells you something is going on. Many people experiencing abuse or neglect are actually ashamed or embarrassed about it and thus keep quiet. If they actually tell you something is going on, that is significant, and you should ask more questions. Clearly, if there are unusual or odd bruises, broken bones, or burns, you should inquire more to see whether there might be physical abuse or mistreatment going on. Unexplained withdrawal from normal activities or sudden change in alertness or demeanor could be indicators of emotional abuse. You might want to ask more about what's happening in their life. Sudden changes in their financial situation could be a result of exploitation. Poor hygiene, unusual weight loss, and certainly bed sores could indicate significant neglect. If you observe family members overtly belittling or threatening the vulnerable adult, that could be an indicator of abuse. The fact that they are willing to do it in front of you suggests that they don't see what they are doing as unusual or wrong. Finally, strained or tense relationships or frequent arguments between caregivers and vulnerable adults are also signs that you might want to explore more with the family. The key is to note any of these signs, and if they occur in combination, to explore the situation with the vulnerable adult and perhaps their family members to better assess what's actually happening. Changes in personality and behavior are often the first manifestations that something is just not right, and investigation may be necessary. But what about bruises? Are bruises a clear indicator that something malicious is going on with the vulnerable adult? Well, it depends. As you can see from these diagrams, bruising can be a normal part of a vulnerable adult or older adult's life. But accidental bruising tends to be less severe and focused more on a person's lower legs and on their arms. Bruising, as reported by abused elders and vulnerable adults, tends to be most significant on the outsides of the arms, which indicates someone protecting their head, and on their face. So bruising does not necessarily mean abuse is occurring. However, significant bruises should raise concerns for you, and you might want to inquire more about what is happening at home. Turning now to child abuse, here are some statistics. A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds, and more than 4 children die every day as a result of child abuse. Child deaths due to maltreatment are oftentimes not recorded as such on death certificates, and the vast majority of children that die from abuse are under the age of 4. So we're talking babies and toddlers here. Almost all juvenile sexual abuse victims know their abuser in some way, so it typically is not a stranger that perpetrates child sexual abuse. Child abuse occurs in all sectors of our culture. It doesn't matter how much income you have, how educated you are, what your religious group or race is, child abuse can occur in any group. Most striking, about a third of abused and neglected children will grow up to later abuse their own children. Like abuse of vulnerable adults, child abuse can take many forms, but can be categorized into 3 broad types. First, There is abuse more generally, which can include physical, emotional, psychological, verbal, or sexual abuse. Second, there is neglect, and almost 80% of child abuse cases are for neglect. Finally, there is abandonment, which is really an extreme form of neglect. Warning signs to watch out for that may indicate child abuse include unexplained injuries, where unusual or odd physical injuries may be present, or the child has an unconvincing explanation of a bruise or injury. Abuse can lead to changes in a child's behavior as well. Abused children often appear scared, anxious, depressed, withdrawn, or more aggressive. Abused children may display behaviors shown at earlier ages, such as thumb-sucking, bedwetting, or fear of the dark or strangers. For some children, even loss of acquired language or memory problems may be an issue. Abused children may express apprehension or anxiety about leaving school or about going places with the person who is abusing them. The stress, fear, and anxiety caused by abuse can lead to changes in a child's eating behaviors, which may result in weight gain or weight loss. Abused children may have frequent nightmares or have difficulty falling asleep, and as a result may appear tired or fatigued. Abused children may have difficulty concentrating in school or have excessive absences, sometimes due to adults trying to hide the children's injuries from authorities. Abused and neglected children may appear uncared for. They may present as consistently dirty and have severe body odor, or they may lack sufficient clothing for the weather. Young people who are being abused may engage in high-risk activities, such as using drugs, alcohol, or carrying a weapon. Finally, children who have been sexually abused may exhibit overly sexualized behavior or use explicit sexual language. The key, again, is to be observant of any children in your care. Some signs that a child is experiencing violence or abuse are more obvious than others. Trust your instincts. Suspected abuse is enough of a reason to contact the abuse hotline. So who are the abusers? Abusers of children and vulnerable adults are both men and women. Family members are most often the abusers than any other group. For several years, data showed that adult children were the most common abusers of family members. However, recent information indicates that spouses are the most common perpetrators of abuse towards vulnerable adults. Strangers are often the perpetrators of financial exploitation, although family members can also be guilty of exploitation. For children, the perpetrators are almost always known to the child. They are rarely strangers. 80% of perpetrators are actually the parent of the child. The bottom line is that abuse and neglect can occur anywhere, anytime, by anyone. Child and adult protective services have been established in every state of the country. States can establish such services under the parens patria power, in other words, to protect those citizens who can't or won't protect themselves. All states also have mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect, and laws requiring such reporting typically eliminate any confidentiality requirements. Some states have voluntary reporting for everyone and then specify certain professionals who must report abuse and neglect. In Florida, mandatory reporting is required for everyone. For vulnerable adults, Section 415.1034 reads, "Any person who knows or has reasonable cause to suspect that a vulnerable adult has been or is being abused, neglected, or exploited shall immediately report such knowledge or suspicion to the Central Abuse Hotline." The statute lists a number of professionals. However, the reporting requirement is not limited to those professionals, and indeed the statute mandates any person to report. For children, Section 39.201 of the Florida statutes reads, "Any person who knows or has reasonable cause to suspect that a child is abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent, legal custodian, caregiver, or other person responsible for the child's welfare, as defined in this chapter, or that a child is in need of supervision and care and has no parent, legal custodian, or responsible adult relative immediately known and available to provide supervision and care, shall report such knowledge or suspicion to the department." So, just as with vulnerable adults, everyone is required to report suspected child abuse or neglect. Definitions of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and abandonment are clearly provided in Section 415 of the Florida Statutes for vulnerable adults and in Section 39 of the Florida Statutes for children. The Florida hotline number is provided here and is easy to remember. It is 1-800-96-ABUSE. So once you report suspected abuse or neglect, what does Protective Services do? Well, they should promptly conduct a civil investigation of the abuse and neglect concern. Depending upon the findings of that investigation, they could provide protective services for the victims of the abuse, interfacing with law enforcement and other agencies. They can help obtain in-home support services or facility-based services for the vulnerable adult or child. They can apply for government assistance to pay for care and services. They can initiate a petition for and/or assist with a guardianship petition and appointment. And finally, they'll provide ongoing monitoring and assessment for abuse victims. The main focus of protective services is to protect the vulnerable adult or child, and they have a number of resources available to them to do that. They try to keep families intact, including obtaining support services for caregivers, but sometimes, depending upon the situation, removal of the vulnerable adult or child from the abusive environment is necessary. It's important for behavioral health professionals to work in collaboration with the protective services professionals in order to ensure the best possible outcome for the abused child or vulnerable adult. This concludes this video lecture on abuse, neglect, and protective services.